I didn't necessarily expect to be saying this, but while I'm kind of not a fan of Disney's approach to remaking films, when it comes to Mufasa, I think I'd rather have had a remake, a CGI remake of Simba's Pride, which granted is one of my favourite Disney films, so I would be quite keen to see what they do with that. But while Mufasa is a fresh story, I didn't really love it. I didn't hate it, but I didn't care for it that much. But maybe I'm biased, because for my entire childhood, The Lion King was my favourite film. Certainly my favourite animation. It's probably the film I've seen more than any other. Certainly in my childhood. I haven't watched it that many times as an adult, but I probably watched it on a weekly basis for about a decade. And with that in mind, the film means a lot to me, and so do the characters. So going into Mufasa, I kind of had high hopes on the one hand, but at the same time, I wasn't really sure what to expect. And having now watched it, I can confirm that it wasn't terrible, but I really just don't think it really has a point. Visually, absolutely gorgeous, but a really weak narrative. And Mufasa, as a character, doesn't feel like Mufasa to me. I don't quite know what I mean by that, but it kind of felt like I wasn't watching Mufasa's origin story, if you will. It just felt like a completely different character. Basically, we go back in time to when Mufasa was a young cub. What I did like, and I have to say I didn't expect this, I didn't see any spoilers going into this. I saw a few small things here and there, but I didn't have any real knowledge of what to expect. I purposely avoided everything. And what I didn't expect was Kiara to be in this. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The film was, of course, released in 2024. It's now on Disney+, at least in the UK. It's directed by Barry Jenkins. It's written by Jeff Nathanson. And we have a cast including Aaron Pierre as Mufasa, Kelvin Harrison Jr. as Taka. We have Blue Ivy Carter as Kiara, which I wasn't expecting Kiara to be in this. And at the start of the film, we have, of course, Simba and Nala and little Kiara, and Kiara is being told the story of her grandfather, Mufasa, and Taka. And I don't know, I feel like it's pretty obvious who Taka is, but I don't want to say it just in case it's not obvious until you start watching the film. But I feel like it's pretty obvious, but I'll maybe mention that in a little bit. But certainly the story of Taka and how that character came to be, I quite liked. So while it's the story of Mufasa, for me, it's more interesting to look at Taka and what that character ultimately became. As I said, I'm pretty sure it's obvious, but I don't want to spoil it just in case. I'll discuss it at the end of the discussion, who Taka actually is. And we find out what Mufasa was like as a young cub and the issues he faced and what it was like growing up. And yeah, it's fine. It's not interesting. It's not that interesting at all, but it's not terrible. It works well enough. The narrative makes sense. We go from A to B without any real issues. I just didn't think it was very interesting. It's not a fascinating story. And as I said, for me, Mufasa doesn't feel like Mufasa. Even when he grew up and he was a bit older in the film, it just never felt like I was watching Mufasa. And I can't quite put my finger on why that is. So I didn't love it. I also feel like they're trying to make Mufasa's story quite emotional, but it just, I'm not saying I was feeling nothing, but it just didn't affect me. And maybe my hopes were too high. Maybe I hold the animated Lion King too dearly. That's certainly something I'm willing to admit. But the narrative just wasn't that interesting. We have Timon and Pumbaa, we have Rafiki, we have Zazu. I think that's a really great decision to include all of those characters. Zazu kind of felt like Zazu. I guess Rafiki did. Timon and Pumbaa, I didn't love them in this. I didn't hate them, but they weren't quite Timon and Pumbaa to me. So there were certain aspects of this that I think were okay, certain aspects that I think were just not very interesting. I guess there's nothing about it that's bad, necessarily. There are just a lot of aspects that are not that great. The soundtrack is fine. The music is okay. I wouldn't say it's particularly great either, but it's fine. And what if I had never seen The Lion King? This is obviously aimed at people who are fans of The Lion King and who want to discover Mufasa's story. But can you watch this if you've never seen The Lion King? Absolutely. But I don't think it's very interesting. I think it would be even less interesting if you haven't seen The Lion King, or if you're not a fan of The Lion King. I really don't think this is worth watching at all. Visually, absolutely stunning. Breathtakingly gorgeous. An absolute joy to look at. The narrative is bland. Taka, I quite liked. Mufasa, really not an interesting character and not an interesting story. The voice acting is fine. The music's okay. So I guess Mufasa is a pretty average film. And in general, I'd say it's worth watching once, as a one-time watch, if you're a Lion King fan. If you don't care for The Lion King, then I'd say it's definitely not worth watching. Not a great film. I don't think it's an interesting story. I don't think we needed this. And as I said, as much as I'm kind of against Disney's remakes, I'll always give them a go, of course. But in general, as much as I'm against them just constantly churning out these remakes, I'd quite like to see Simba's Pride. Largely because I love the music, as long as you get the music in it, because it's absolutely fabulous. Yes, I was happy to see Kiara here. I thought that was a nice way to set the story up. But beyond that, Mufasa is a pretty average film. And I will now discuss very briefly Taka. Taka is, of course, Scar. And as I said, I quite enjoyed Taka's story in this. Not enough to save the film, not enough for me to come away from this feeling satisfied with the experience, but I certainly found Taka to be a lot more interesting than Mufasa. So, credit where it's due. Taka was pretty decent, and it was quite nice to have that story for Scar. In general, Mufasa the Lion King, not a great film, but maybe it's worth watching once.